Can I please have a massive round of applause for James?
Danny, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be here this morning. Whilst much of what I refer to today is 105 years ago, as a serving member of the British Army, I would suggest much of it is true today. And I'm not here to talk about today's army or defence, but I am here to reflect back on lessons and things we learned 105 years ago that maybe, just maybe, we might have taken a little bit more notice of since then. What I wish to do is to convince you of this thesis. And towards the end, I'll make specific reference to document that thesis. Make specific reference to the document on the left-hand side, an unpublished stationary service manual that was due to be published in the spring of 1918, that contained within it doctrine that the Chief of the General Staff today would look at and go, that's good. I can use it right now. In many respects, it was so ahead of its time, people didn't quite know what to do with it. But in actual fact, what held it back was a German spring offensive and then our reaction, and we didn't quite get round to using it. But the text on the right-hand side that is attributed to Henry Horne whilst commanding First Army, I think sums up my own personal position on where the First World War went. I'm going to give you a little bit of personal reflection on how I got here, but then just talk about briefly some of the reasons I think that didn't necessarily contribute to success. But my own story has some very pertinent resonance with this theme. In January 2007, I got up out of a trench, having adjusted the artillery fire, with machine gun fire coming towards me. And whilst this sounds ridiculous, my only thought was, I wonder if the doctrine will hold together. Which wasn't a rational thought. There was far more to worry about. But in a moment of clarity that comes in such chaos and confusion, and there was a lot of chaos and confusion, I genuinely wondered, would the plan hold together? Would people do as they should? Would the machine guns switch fire? Would the artillery move to a depth position? Had the sappers done what they told me they had done? It was rather important they did. And broadly, would the orchestration of a tactical battle in Helmand Province occur as we had trained for based on our contemporary doctrine? That lasted 2 seconds, then it went really bad. Well, it wasn't too bad, but it was chaos. But it was fascinating to me that I was thinking, I wonder how this all hangs together. And that effectively set me on a journey of understanding our doctrine in the British Army better, and eventually to write quite a few words about it. But in writing those words, I had to first justify, was it really about doctrine, or was it about some of these things on the screen? I was fascinated by reading the Landship Committee minutes. The design of the first tank had 6-pounder guns on the side due to a cancelled dreadnought order by the Royal Navy, who had bought them and had nothing else to do with them. And a machine designed to flatten the ground to cross no man's land, which we'll come back to, coincidentally ended up with armaments because, well, we had some spare. In itself, a bizarre little story, and it's not meant to undermine the brilliance of that design and the work done. But it's almost just a little taste of how things happen in advance, almost by mistake, but for great benefit. I think bottom left, the invention of the L106 grazing fuse, almost in itself resolved the 1915 shell crisis, not because we got more shells, but it made more shells go bang. As I'm sure you know, most of the percussion fuses we started with in that war needed something quite hard to hit in order to go bang. And until we got that fuse, many of them went into soft bog and just didn't, which contributed to the fact we needed more ammunition. And in itself, the lethality of the British Army effectively doubled overnight because every round went bang with that fuse. So that had a huge contribution, but I don't think it was decisive. I think the invention of the wireless and its implementation is brought forward into the trenches to allow us to amend our tactical plans was a key point. But of course it remained fragile and was only really in its infancy. But that towards the end certainly helped the tactics of allowing the commander when he could or should deploy his reserve. And of course the actions of the Royal Flying Corps, not in their air-to-air combat, but in their reconnaissance role, really allowed us to understand the enemy's movement and shape what was happening behind the front line, so we knew where their reserves were. I also put up this picture because I'm not sure if you can see, I always wonder what happened to this spaniel. And whether that spaniel had to go flying every day. But lastly, bottom right. Sorry, my apologies. Lastly, bottom right, the commanders of the British Expeditionary Force, Hay, Gough, French, Horn, et al. Obviously, they had a huge part to play, and obviously they directed as they best could manoeuvres on the Western Front with their allies, and how the enemy advanced or didn't on their luck, and the strategic resupply made a huge difference. But I still think today that what held victory together with the fact that eventually someone went, what we're doing isn't very good. We need to think about it better, write some doctrine and train. And I'm going to land that at the feet of Douglas Haig, and I'll explain how. What I'm not talking about today, which may come up in questions, is that in order to get the British Expeditionary Force across the Channel in 1914, there had been 3 big commissions after the Boer War that had certainly helped to reshape us. And the divisions and cavalry division that eventually goes to France in 1914 is probably only capable of doing it because of the Elgin, Norfolk and Esher commissions that reshape, rebalance, change the reserves, move away from militia to territorial, etc., and do great work. But that's for another day. In my thesis, my external examiner was Professor Gary Sheffield, who back in the 80s had put forward the theory of the learning curve, and it's a huge bit of research and how an organisation changes. But again, that's not for today, and I completely agree with it, although I'm not sure it's a curve, it's more of a higgledy-piggledy line. I would say if there's someone to pick out, Lord Haldane as Secretary of State for War, the changes he made up to 1912 to sort of reshape the armed forces, to put the right money in the right place, to capitalise the Royal Navy, and to put the British Army in a war footing with 2 battalions, 1 overseas, 1 home, all that work, seminal. And probably, in my humble opinion, our best Secretary of State for War in the work he did post-Boer War to set us up for First World War success. The anti-intellectualism debate is fascinating, and I love the fact that officers were selected, and of course still then who you were and what you were was equally as important, if not more, to what you could do. But there's always a degree of, if you could ride well cross country and hunt and you came from the right stuff, you would be good in combat, which of course the First World War changes quite convincingly. But that anti-intellectualism was almost, you were bookish and boring if you were to study the advances. And you were bookish and boring if you were to study the art of war. And if you mentioned Jomini or Sun Tzu or Clausewitz, you were to be belittled. Of course, the First World War changes that to a degree. I would say we might be back there, but that's another debate for another day. And lastly, this culture of the offensive. How marvellous it must have been to be a 16-year-old newly commissioned officer leading the forlorn hope into a battle or a situation where pre-First World War there was effectively no hope of you succeeding or surviving, and yet if you weren't attacking you were losing. Again, the First World War changes that, and together I think there's 5 more lectures, but not today. So far so good? Yes. Smashing. So there are some words I'm going to use today that really are worth getting our heads round. I will talk about the transformation of the British Expeditionary Force across the 3 components of fighting power. Fighting power being how you sort of decide an army is good or not. And you break up an army's output into the moral, conceptual and physical. Moral, has it got the ethical base? Will its officers and soldiers behave appropriately and do the right thing at the right time? The leadership code. Conceptual, does it understand how to apply force and brutality? Does it understand how to bring things together and to orchestrate the dance of warfare? And physical, both has it trained appropriately and is equipped appropriately? If you change the moral, conceptual and physical all enough, you have transformed your army. And transformation, like innovation, is a very in vogue word in the British Armed Forces and probably in society as well, I imagine. But we often get mistaken. Because when we replace one tank for another tank, actually that's modernisation, because you've just changed the tank, especially if you haven't changed the doctrine. If you just change the doctrine, that's just adaptation. But you've got to change all three to truly transform. And I think in the First World War, by the end, we had. But you've got to follow that journey. And also it explains why just leadership and personality can't transform you on your own. But change, modernisation, adaptation are good in their own right. They make the little step changes. But if you truly want to win a world war, you have to transform, and there's more to it than a new tank or an airplane. Some of the words, which are dictionary definitions here, or just my understanding, also help. Learning, to me, is a summation of everything else. Together, an organisation learns. But lessons are when you take knowledge from what you've seen or what you've heard about. Doctrine are the rules by which you train. Training is a collective endeavour, and education is an individual endeavour. Today in the British Army, we go on staff courses, we go to the academy at Shrivenham, and that's about me as a student being taught learning. And that is my education. When we leave those organisations, we go to our units and we go on exercise on Salisbury Plain and bring everybody together, and everybody's education comes together. That is training. And I'll speak latterly about training, collective training, but not so much about education, because that was much harder to change in the First World War. If you get your lessons, your doctrine, your training and education right, then you can transform. But my goodness, when you're dealing with armies of that size, getting all that together at the same place, that's a challenge. So, ladies and gentlemen in the room and those online, that's me setting the scene. We'll get into the good bit. I would suggest that after the battle or the campaign of the Somme by November, we had seen what hadn't worked and what hadn't succeeded. And as to why we're at the Somme and what happened in Verdun and supporting our French allies and all that, absolutely fascinating. But by November 15, it hadn't worked to any tangible benefit. We had paid some huge sacrifices, we had lost a lot of equipment, and we were doctrinally standing still. If you read Haig's war diaries, he mulls this over day after day after day. And I think November to December 1915, whilst he's doing all his other correspondence, most of it is littered with reference to how do we fight better. I think it's fascinating that in January 1917, at his commander's conference, he sets forward the challenge that we must fight in a new, reimagined, combined manner. And I think it's the first time we start to hear the terminology of combined. Whilst he doesn't specifically explain it that day, in other references he refers to moving from a game of checkers to a game of chess. Checkers being one move at a time, one form of unit, one measure of currency. And in chess, he explains, chess wins when all the pieces are placed perfectly to put the opposition in checkmate. And I think that's quite a nice analogy, because you've gone from a sort of bit-by-bit approach, one at a time of equals, to how do we orchestrate all the different pieces in order to come out with a singular outcome. And the doctrinal revolution I think we get is synonymous with moving from playing checkers to chess. I should point out, when I gave this lecture a couple of weeks ago, half the audience, who were, may I say, a touch younger than you, had no idea what checkers was. But I'm guessing you're happy with checkers, yeah? Nodding. Thank you very much indeed. The seminal changes he makes at that conference in 1917 is he has discussed with his chiefs, who should we pick to lead this revolution? And I think one of his second genius moves is he takes his best brigade commander, Brigadier Arthur Solly-Flood, and his best divisional commander, General Sir Ivor Maxey, and says, right, you are right now performing better than all your peers. And your peers know that you're in the first 15, you're the A-team here. I'm going to take my two best, promote you out, and you're going to lead my doctrinal revolution. Again, if I were to give you a slightly naughty and flippant contemporary comment, that's not how we do it today. Our best is still commanding, and I wonder if our best leading a doctrinal and training and education revolution might not give us a better answer. But I think that was absolutely brilliant of Haig. So what he does with the then Arthur Solly Flood and Ivor Maxey at the bottom there, is he sets up the Directorate of Training, the Training Directorate. And by the way, half the time it's a Training Directorate and half the time it's the Director of Training. I'm not sure which one it was, but much confusion. And he sets up a vehicle by which we would understand, learn, refine, write and publish doctrine. Now, no one's ever found Arthur Solly Flood's diaries or documents, and if you do, I'd love, if anybody's related, many of us would love those. But much was written about Maxey, and he recounts much of this good work in his relationship with Solly Flood. The very fact that we had picked two geniuses who had proved themselves in battle to then think and reflect and write shows we're on a change of direction, and shows that no longer was Haig fixed by how can I employ the tank now, but how can I bring it together. I think the problem he set them, that is sort of spun around on numerous correspondence, eventually comes down to you need to devise a method and a training philosophy for the BEF to cross no man's land. And the only challenge he set them was to cross no man's land. He didn't set to break into win, cross, because I think Haig believed if you can do that, everything else would fall from that simple premise. But it is a fascinating challenge, because of course by 1917, no man's land, which had been relatively static, was now an absolute quagmire of rotting corpses, wire and shell craters. More of our soldiers in 1917 were drowning in shell craters than being killed by the shrapnel, and crossing them through a wet summer and a very boggy winter had become almost impossible. So I love the fact that the challenge was so simple: cross no man's land. I think there are two elements. There's the physical, how to get across such undulating, miserable, destitute ground. And secondly, how do you get across in a tactically sound manner so that when you have, you're able to do something. And those two challenges come out throughout the work we're about to hear. So let's just talk briefly about doctrine. And there's one thing to note about how we describe doctrine: everyone's got an opinion on it. I still like the definition of doctrine is what is taught, because it's really simple, and that works for my simple gunner brain. But there's other ways of devising as well. But the doctrine that was written primarily was communicated in the stationary service publications, and never has an amount of information sounded so bland. But the stationary service, who were a printing organisation of the government, they knocked out our doctrine, of which I was going to show you my 5 closely guarded, beautifully pristine examples, which are currently sitting on my dining room table this morning, and didn't make it to the train. My apologies. But by using the stationary service publications, we communicated the doctrinal change that allowed the BEF to fight better. The publications effectively fall into pre and post-Somme. Pre had a foundation that actually was based on when Douglas Haig was the Director of Studies at Staff College, and he had working for him a young colonel called Arthur Solly Flood, who you've heard about, so that relationship was already there. And post is the Arthur Solly Flood as a brigadier moving forward. I should also point out, whilst there's many official publications, there are quite a few unofficial that were very well received. My point here is this is 5 screens from a list of 12 screens of all the stationary service publications. There was 380. And you had everything from construction latrines to the division in the offensive, sport and recreation to lice control, machine gun emplacement to trench digging. If you did it in the army, there was a pamphlet. Something beautiful about these pamphlets is they were A5, so they could fit in your little pocket. They were brilliantly written in such lovely, concise English, and at the time, the way they were written was away from the turgid bright, sort of smart English, and they were written in very accessible, very easy to understand English, which I think meant they were far more compelling and easy. They also, by 1917, at the back had 8 blank pages in most of them, with a tear line and notes, where you could write your notes and fold and send them back up the chain of command to say your comments. And that simple tearaway that you had an ability to communicate back to say, I experienced this and this worked or this didn't, starts to derive some change in the business of doctrine. These are still available on eBay. They pop up every now and then for 50p, and they're gold dust, some of these. Absolutely. Some are a lot more than that. To give you an example, this is left to right the campaign, and this is how we wrote our doctrine. So you can see that in actual fact, I mean, it's not an exponential curve, but you can see, but in the middle of the war, we're really knocking out more and more doctrine. And I think this explanation shows you quite nicely that, oops, sorry, these 3 themes is what was driving the change. And these 3 were general, tactics, and trenches. And that's actually where we're changing our doctrine. And everybody else is doing their bit, machine guns, mortars, logistics, but this is what's driving this. And if you think about it, your artillery, your tactics, general and trenches, of course, for a First World War gunner's war, that seems quite relevant, that how it's being employed changes. I should point out, of course, that the artillery doctrine included sound ranging and its own sustainment. It wasn't all about using big guns, but sound ranging in itself was a huge, fantastic technology that changed the world for us, which is a lecture for another day. So I referred to earlier the training directorate. It had 3 branches: the schools, the education, and the publications, and it had 3 seminal writers. The training directorate moves around not far from general headquarters, but most of the time is only 12 to 13, maybe 15 people, not even a rugby team. And it is staff writers, some scribes or runners as it were, and 3 or 4 genius doctrine writers. For me, Gorrell, Grieg and Headlam are the people who come in and turn concepts and tearaway slips and interviews with the current GOCs and divisional and corps commanders into our new doctrine. What's fascinating is they're not particularly successful military officers in the field. In fact, most of them were quite severely wounded, and this was coming back from recovery. 2 of them were former writers for newspapers in London, and one of them was there more by birth than appointment. But they write beautiful prose, and it's so easy to understand. And something that could be so complicated is put across in a concise, easy, methodical way to understand. And even the chapters and layout mean that if you're thinking you want to communicate something that's inherently quite dull but complex, the way they craft it is brilliant. And I know it's brilliant because when I read it and didn't understand the context, it was so easy to get through. So if you're looking for a person, looking to a person, the uncelebrated Gorrell, Grieg and Headlam probably held at their pen or typewriter the doctrinal evolution that allows the British Expeditionary Force to fundamentally transform itself. And it's a shame we don't know much more about them. So I said that the doctrine of the British Expeditionary Force had a pre- and post-Somme sort of theme, but there was plenty of good doctrine before we go to war. The Field Service Regulations of 1909, which gets updated quite regularly, even though it was updated, actually the 1909 version was good enough to give you your basics of how you move an army through, how you train, how you administer, how you command control, etc. And it was a foundation that didn't change much, but it was the foundation from which other things were written. And also the infantry training of 1914, the 2 books on the left-hand side, really set the context for how you're going to take people who haven't done this before, equip them, train them, indoctrinate them, and send them forward into campaigns. And today, they're still available. The little A5, they're only about, I don't know, half an inch thick, but they're just brilliantly put down and easy to read. The fact they survived this long itself is testament to their success. Then you have SS, Stationary Service 135 and 152. And this is when things sort of go from the other end. This is when we are now writing our most exceptional doctrine. the training and employment of divisions. And of course, as all enthusiastic First World War historians, you know that the division was really the unit of choice. Below divisions, general headquarters weren't too excited. They were moving divisions around. Occasionally brigades got a bit of a course celeb, but divisions was that unit. And therefore, not only how you would train them, but then from that training, employ them, codifies all that good work. And building on from that, if you're going to do that, how you train armies. So I'm going to take you back to a step of 1915 in the Somme, and with a children's audience not long ago, or sorry, dare I say a slightly younger audience, only slightly. I asked 6 of them to come up in a line in front of me. I asked them to stand broadly shoulder to shoulder, and I asked them to shut their eyes and walk forward. And when I said go, I asked them to walk forward. I gave them no more instructions than that. And of course what happened, I can't do it because the camera shot, is they all walked at different paces and ended up going slightly different directions. Because no one had coordinated them or given the doctrine to do it better. And if you want another simple gunner analogy, pre-Somme, that was our methods of advance. Whatever broad rate the GOC liked, in broadly whichever direction they liked. And post-Somme or post-this doctrine, they knew the pace and rate of advance, where the guns would start, where they'd stop, what the sappers had done and how the logistics had supported them. And eventually the metaphor would be you would move forward 5 shoulder to shoulder. I know it is a dumbing down of much good work in leadership, technology and doctrine, but it's a really simple way of imagining that's fundamental change. And if you are 5 kids going different directions, you can understand, for many other reasons, but not least that, why the Somme was not a good day for us. At the other end, platoon tactics. So the platoon has transformed in shape. It's got a lot smaller, but it now has a lot more equipment. It started the First World War, as you know, as basically 35, 40 soldiers with an individual rifle, someone to lead them and someone sergeant majorly to sort of control them, or a sergeant, and a few junior NCOs. And all those officers came from what we could only say today is a privileged background, and those senior soldiers were scarce, the ones with credibility, and the junior soldiers were a mixed bunch. But towards the end of the war, we are now getting platoon tactics that tell them exactly how to manage, train, advance, dig latrines, patrol, scout, employ machine guns. So no one was making it up. Everyone had something to read. And this is the professionalisation of the volunteer army that is making huge sacrifice, but can now start to move and fight as one. And whilst these are not as exciting as divisionals in the army or the army in France, the details in here, in even recreational training, in recreational training, it basically said how to nick a football, or if you can't nick one, how to find one, if you can't find one, what to make one out of. And in actual fact, if you think of what was happening behind the front line on the few occasional R&R days, football and team sports were used not only for the moral component motivation, but also for a bit of fitness training. And it's in there, and it's really nicely written. It's not quite jumpers for goalposts, but it's not far off. So, I appreciate I'm pushing my luck in keeping you going for half an hour doctrine, but we're nearly there. Post-Somme doctrine. I think these are the 3 that set us on our way. And in actual fact, a revised 152, a revised 135, and in actual fact coming down a 143, which is platoons. And the reason 143 is so exciting is it's the first time we start to see really good coordination between platoons and between companies. It makes reference to 152 and 135, and we now have a hierarchy of doctrine and a hierarchy of training and a hierarchy of employment. I should also point out that whilst on the left were official, on the right was by Sir Robert Baden-Powell, who goes on to do some stuff with Boy Scouts. His unofficial Quick Training for War was equally popular and very good reading. And I'm yet to track down my own copy, but in actual fact what you can see of it in facsimile is really, again, beautifully written and nice and concise. And I think where it worked well is it was a slight challenge, but still heading in the right direction. It's certainly referred to in many people's diaries as a useful book. So, towards the end of my thesis writing, I'm in the Bodleian Library and I've read a colleague's thesis that points out box 8. I need to go and find box 8. And of course there's always an amazing librarian there, an archivist, who brings me this big nondescript box of unfiltered papers. And in it is a copy of this. And in this document, in the unpublished 198, is the summation of 5 years of warfighting in what today we would call combined arms warfare. And as I'm sitting there, late already when I get the box, I spend the rest of the day reading what is just brilliant doctrine in its precision and its understanding. It's actually written by Grieg in about 6 weeks, by all accounts, and it's got many hand amendment notes all over it, as it were. But it delivers combined arms warfare for 1918. Thankfully, we never use it because there is success and victory. But I often wonder what would happen if we had got to use it and how amazing in warfare sense it would have been. It is the summation of the doctrine I've already spoken to you about, and also the lessons from recent operations. And it builds in so much of what had happened. So, of only 4 chapters and a book that I think is only 62 pages long and it's in A5, it goes through these 4 areas. Chapter 1 is brilliant because it's effectively saying this is where we are today and this is how the German army are fighting, and these are our constraints and these are our freedoms. And it lays down German trench construction and their weak points. It lays down our French colleagues and what they do and don't do. It gives us the strengths and weaknesses of our tactics and the strengths and weaknesses of the German tactics. It then goes into just 3 easy chapters, and the chapters talking about the infantry no longer advancing en masse, the infantry being subservient to 2 other parts of the army at the time in order to deliver a more precise and better outcome. In the artillery integration, it's effectively putting the artillery formally and officially at driving the plan. In close cooperation with infantry, and whilst it makes more of a piece of the artillery will enable and the infantry will follow, it actually, I think, in a far more balanced manner, talks about the equal cooperation. And lastly, the use of the flying corps as reconnaissance to set the conditions to fight the deep battle. And it's the first time you start to read a lot of, if you can stop the German reserves moving here or the German logistics moving there, then actual fact success will come. In today's terms, you're fighting a deep battle. It considers at every occasion how you cross no man's land from platoon to company, battalion, brigade to division to corps levels. It uses this word combination time and time again and says you mustn't leave gaps or give opportunity. It has given a configuration now for really quite small battalion groups, but a battalion group that has its own intimate artillery observation, its own intimate Royal Engineer support, its own communications, and its own part of the bigger plan. It talks about fighting the strategic battle first and cutting off German reserves and logistics so that by the time you come forward in your battle, success is almost inevitable. And there's an expression of leading with our guns, and it means artillery, not machine guns, time and time again. The reference to the Royal Flying Corps, or by then the Royal Air Force, of their ability to see, report back and communicate for where enemy reinforcements come is seminal because it allows our corps commanders to deploy their reserve in a far more precise manner. And lastly, the wireless enabling these moves or change of plan, I think, gives together a combined arms warfare effect that we just hadn't seen that well delivered. We might have seen it at Battle of Cambrai in the first 24 hours, but this is the summation. This is brilliant and would have been brilliant. So, to sum up, things we haven't got into today. This was enabled because there was a school system throughout France and Belgium that put this doctrine and training into place. And some of the unsung heroes are the senior soldiers who taught, or the wounded officers who taught in those schools. The officer training and how we change it throughout the First World War has a huge effect, and also the percentage of our officers who have come through the ranks, because it puts experience at the very front. And the designing of the school system and the subsequent follow-on training is basically a story of rationalisation. And instead of lots and lots of little schools, bigger schools where they're all being taught one set of doctrine. And that leads to our success. I should also point out that the lessons process is broadly anyone could contribute a lesson, but lessons really was a Darwinian system. If you survived to write the lesson, odds on it was a good lesson. And whilst that sounds pretty grim, there seems to be a degree of that, because if you had a lesson that didn't survive, odds on it wasn't. So the lessons come forward from tear-off pages and doctrine, or from the formal reports, which actually get published in a series of books called Lessons from the Front, add up to the change and end up with Headlam and Grieg to change our doctrine. Of course we have formal battle reports, and of course we have interviews from senior officers, but together the SS series on notes on reading fighting make brilliant, up-to-date, contemporary reading by 1917-18, where commanders can almost see day by day how the Germans are acting and how we're reacting. For me, these are the divisions that led with that change. Now, it might not be that they were leading, but it's that there's evidence to find today. And I'll leave you with one little quick scenario. And I'm sorry it's not a bit higher, but I draw your attention to this part here. And if you can get to the bottom, there's one lovely little nuance of the change in doctrine. I appreciate it's not easy for everybody to read, and I'll sum it up in a moment. And it's probably a little bit mean because it's the last line, but really here is you've got a barrage, the Cambridgeshire is going to lead, but to endeavour to establish platoon posts at the following points. This was no longer a battalion advance en masse, and victory and success wasn't getting to a line. Success now by the summer of 1918 is about platoons gaining strategically important little posts, which then could be knitted together. And it's just a nice example of how our doctrine and our orders had changed. Ladies and gentlemen, in 40 minutes, I hope I've tried or got doctrine to be slightly more exciting than its reputation. I think it's born of a session of learning, of lessons, that new doctrine. And in SS 198, you really did have information that today's army commanders could use. It was that far ahead of its time. It might have been 105 years old, but the brilliance in its creation, the clarity with which it was written, to a degree it's just a shame it was never employed. I should also footnote that by the time we get to 1939, it had been forgotten. I think doctrine almost saved the day, and if you'd like to read more, there's a quite clunky PhD at that link. Thank you ever so much for your time and attention. You've been very kind.